Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today is January 8th, 2025, and as always, we find ourselves standing on the other side of the aisle. That's right, we're here to bring you the latest in British politics, from a perspective that dares to ask the tough questions. You can expect sharp commentary, deep dives, and unfiltered analysis as we tackle the hottest topics of the day. So, if you're ready to join in on the conversation, hit that like button, and let's get started.
As the January chill clung to the air, the political landscape in Britain was already heating up, with Labour facing an early crisis in 2025. The fallout of a recent TV interview on the BBC's flagship evening programme, Newsnight, was still echoing through the halls of Westminster. It was here that seasoned journalist Victoria Darbishire took to task Labour MP Steven Kinnock, in what would soon be dubbed one of the most cringe-inducing political interviews of the year. The studio lights were harsh, casting long shadows over Kinnock's face as he settled into his seat. Victoria Darbishire, known for her relentless pursuit of the truth, didn't waste a second. Her voice was clear, her gaze unwavering. "Stephen, let's talk about the Prime Minister's recent comments on the grooming gang scandal. Do you agree with his assessment that those calling for a national inquiry might be seen as jumping on a far-right bandwagon?" Kinnock, with a smile that seemed more like a grimace, began his dance around the question. "Well, Victoria, it's important to understand the complexities of this issue. We must consider the broader context in which these comments were made." Victoria, undeterred, leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening. "But that's not an answer, is it? The Prime Minister suggested that calling for an inquiry could be seen as supporting far-right narratives. Do you share that view?" Kinnock shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the side as if hoping for an escape route. "What I'm saying is, we need to look at all aspects of this issue, including community relations and the impact of our words on those relations." The audience watching at home could almost feel the frustration emanating from Victoria as she pressed on. "Again, you're not answering the question, Stephen. A victim from Telford, one of the areas most affected by these gangs, has publicly demanded an inquiry. Is she, in your view, jumping on the far-right bandwagon by doing so?" Kinnock's response was a study in political evasion. "I think it's crucial we support all victims, but we must also be mindful not to stir up unnecessary division. We need to tread carefully, Victoria." Victoria's face was a mask of professional composure, but her words carried an edge. Careful treading seems to be avoiding the question yet again. "You're refusing to clarify Labour's stance on this, which is quite telling, isn't it? Are you afraid of alienating voters by giving a straight answer?" The tension in the studio was palpable, the camera capturing every nuance of Kinnock's discomfort. No, it's not about fear. It's about ensuring we handle this with the nuance it requires. We need a balanced approach." Victoria leaned back, her expression one of mock surprise. "Balanced approach or dodging the issue? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. This isn't just about politics, it's about justice for victims. Why can't you give a straight yes or no?" Kinnock, now visibly sweating under the studio lights, tried one last maneuver. "Look, Victoria, this is not about yes or no. It's about the broader implications and ensuring we don't fuel division." With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of public frustration, Victoria concluded, "Steven Kinnock, thank you for joining us, though I'm not sure we've got much clarity tonight. Viewers, make of that what you will." The screen cut back to the studio, leaving viewers to ponder the implications of such political gymnastics. The interview was a microcosm of Labour's turbulent start to the year, highlighting not just a party in disarray but one seemingly out of touch with the straightforward demands for accountability and transparency from the public. As the segment ended, social media buzzed with reactions, many lambasting Kinnock for his performance. "This is why people are fed up with politicians," one post read, capturing the sentiment of disillusionment spreading across the nation. The Labour Party, once a beacon of change, now seemed bogged down in its own rhetoric, unable to address the stark realities facing communities across Britain. This interview was more than a moment of political theatre, it was a stark reminder of the challenges facing Labour as they navigate the rocky political waters of 2025. With every dodged question, the party's image suffered, leaving many to wonder if they could recover their footing or if this was the beginning of a much longer, more painful stumble.
Kinnock's evasive behavior was enough to make anyone cringe. As he stood there, trying to sidestep the pressing issue, his mind seemed to drift away from the real conversation that needed to take place. The country, once again, was left with the same question that had been lingering for far too long. When would the government take proper action on grooming gangs? The exploitation of young victims across the country, from Telford to towns far and wide, was not an issue that could simply be ignored. Yet, that's exactly what Kinnock seemed to do. A lone voice, that of a victim from Telford, broke through the noise. This individual, with the weight of a painful past, had the courage to speak out publicly. With a mixture of sadness and anger, the victim demanded a national inquiry. We've been waiting for years, and still no justice. How many more lives must be destroyed before we see action? The words echoed through the room, a stark reminder of the silence that had surrounded the issue for far too long. And yet, what was Kinnock's response? Nothing substantial, nothing that would reassure the public that something would finally be done. Instead, he sidestepped the question, as if the lives of these victims were a mere footnote in his agenda. "Well, I believe the recommendations from the previous reviews are sufficient," he muttered, his voice trailing off as if he was simply reciting lines he had memorized. The words felt hollow, as though they were meant to end the conversation, not address the problem at hand. His dismissive stance was almost palpable. One could feel the frustration of the victims, the growing impatience of those who had been waiting for answers. "This is not good enough, Neil," a fellow MP retorted, frustration evident in their tone. "You can't just sweep this under the carpet with a few lines from an outdated report. People are dying for real answers." It was an uncomfortable moment. The public, as well as his own colleagues, began to see Kinnock for what he truly was, a man more concerned with deflecting blame than with taking responsibility. It wasn't lost on anyone that this was far from the first time he had pulled the wool over the public's eyes. Time and time again, he had dodged difficult questions, choosing to present the illusion of progress without ever delivering results. A fellow journalist, standing in the back of a room, whispered to their colleague, "You know, it's like he thinks if he says the words enough times, the problem will just disappear. It's a bloody disgrace, really." The frustration was shared across the room, palpable in every whispered exchange. Kinnock, despite his title and position, seemed to be nothing more than a figurehead, a puppet in the hands of those who preferred to ignore uncomfortable truths. "Do you really believe that this is enough?" Another critic chimed in. "How many children need to be harmed before you're willing to acknowledge that your party has failed them?" The silence that followed was deafening. Kinnock shuffled uncomfortably, looking around as though hoping someone would come to his rescue. But there was no one. The weight of his inadequacy was settling over him, like a thick fog that wouldn't lift. But it wasn't just Kinnock who was avoiding responsibility. Across the political spectrum, those who had been in power during the years of neglect were now trying to wriggle their way out of the situation, offering little more than half-hearted apologies and empty promises. And yet, they all knew the truth. The truth was that nothing had been done. The grooming gangs were still operating with impunity, and the victims were still waiting for justice. And it was the public, with their sharp eye for detail, who saw right through the politicians' rhetoric. "Enough of this nonsense," one member of the public called out from the back. "We've been patient long enough. When are you lot going to do something about this?" Kinnock, caught in the crossfire, attempted yet another deflection. "As I said, we are reviewing the recommendations from previous reports. There is a process in place." But the words fell flat. The public, the victims, and the critics weren't buying it anymore. They knew that after years of waiting, reviewing recommendations was no longer an acceptable excuse. They needed action, not talk. They needed a plan, not just vague promises. A longtime journalist, who had followed Kinnock for years, remarked to a colleague, "You know, he's really showing his true colors today. He's just trying to get through this without being pinned down, hoping the media will forget by tomorrow. But we won't forget. And neither will the people." Indeed, the people had had enough. The media, too, had long since stopped tolerating the empty words. It wasn't just the victims' families who were demanding action. It was society at large. And as the backlash from the public grew louder, Kinnock's attempts to downplay the issue seemed more and more futile. Later that day, a member of Kinnock's own party was overheard talking to another MP. "I can't believe he's handling this so poorly. This issue could have been our opportunity to show real leadership. But now, thanks to him, we're in the thick of another scandal." It was true. The opportunity to address the grooming gang's issue was slipping through their fingers. And for all Kinnock's bluster and his half-hearted deflections, the reality remained. The government had failed the people. The victims of grooming gangs were still waiting for justice, and their cries for accountability were being met with nothing but silence. The situation was a stark reminder of the gulf that existed between those in power and the public they were meant to serve. Kinnock's reluctance to face the truth was not just a political misstep, it was a failure of leadership. A failure to confront the darkest corners of society, and a failure to protect the most vulnerable. As the evening drew to a close, the room remained tense. Kinnock, looking defeated, had said nothing more of substance. The questions had been asked, and the answers had been absent. The public had seen enough. And the critics, ever vigilant, knew this was not the end. They would continue to hold those in power to account, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. For the victims, there could be no peace until justice was served. In the debate surrounding the potential establishment of a national inquiry into grooming gangs, the opposition has raised its voice strongly, and it's not merely about the government's avoidance tactics. The central issue here is whether a national inquiry is truly needed to ensure that those responsible are held accountable for the suffering of the victims of these horrific crimes. The situation is grave, and it's not just the accusations, but the fierce response from those demanding justice that is setting the tone for the discussion. Robert Jenrick, a staunch critic of the government's approach, has not held back in pointing out what he perceives as the government's passive stance on the matter. Jenrick did not mince his words when he said that the government's failure to act has allowed thousands, if not tens of thousands, of young girls to fall victim to horrific abuse. In his intervention, he raised his voice to condemn the government's indifference and, with scorn, accused Prime Minister Keir Starmer of attacking those demanding a national inquiry. According to Jenrick, the government continues to turn a blind eye to such a serious issue, fearing the backlash of political correctness, something that has prevented justice for victims for far too long. During a heated session in the House of Commons, Jenrick addressed the opposition benches, a mix of frustration and determination in his tone. Firmly, he began his speech. "Look, this isn't just about politics. This is about justice. The lack of a national inquiry leaves the victims unprotected, and the government continues with the same old stance, doing nothing. How many more girls must suffer before this government takes action?" At that moment, a voice from the government benches interrupted, incredulity and defensiveness in their tone. "Do you seriously imply that our government's response has been insufficient, Jenrick? We are doing this with reason, not shouting in the corridors like a mob. We are working, but we understand our limits." Jenrick was undeterred by the interruption. With a disapproving gesture, he responded, "No, what we're seeing is a total inability to face a crisis of this magnitude. The limits you speak of are the ones that have been preserving political correctness for years. Meanwhile, innocent girls continue to be victims, and the government keeps looking the other way. Are you afraid of facing reality?" The Prime Minister, sitting in his seat, observed in silence as his government defended itself against the accusations, but the tension was palpable. Jenrick, now looking squarely at the other side of the hall, continued, "We've been told time and time again that this is a sensitive issue, that we shouldn't speak too harshly on it for fear of offending sensitivities. And what about the victims? Who has asked them if they care about political sensitivities? The victims care about justice, and that's what we need, not more empty promises." At that moment, a young opposition MP stood, their face marked with concern but also conviction, knowing that something had to change. With a low but urgent voice, they intervened. "We cannot keep brushing this issue under the carpet. Up and down the country, the voices of those demanding justice are being ignored. The government continues to play politics with fear, while our streets remain a backdrop to unaccountable violence." Jenrick nodded his head, as though the young intervention confirmed everything he'd been saying for weeks. This wasn't merely a political issue, but a moral one that went beyond electoral calculations. Justice couldn't be suppressed by party interests. The Prime Minister, until now maintaining a relatively calm posture, could not contain himself and interrupted with a sharp response. "Jenrick, you know this isn't as simple as you make it sound. To make a hasty judgment won't get us anywhere. Solutions don't come from shouting across the chamber. They come from effective measures, which is what we are doing. You should think a bit more about the consequences before making those accusations." Jenrick, with an even more challenging tone, replied, "Effective measures? What measures are you talking about? The ones that have been hiding the problem for years? Because that's all we've seen. If you really wanted to do something, we would have had a national inquiry a long time ago. As Jenrick continued to defend his position, other members of Parliament, fed up with the government's evasions, raised their voices in support of a national inquiry. Their voices joined together in a chorus of indignation, each one expressing the same feeling of frustration towards a government that seemed to disregard the obvious demands for justice. A voice from the right wing, filled with passion and energy, intervened. "We are here to do justice, not to protect those who have failed time and again. The government is more concerned with not upsetting certain groups than facing the harsh truth. The victims deserve to be heard, and we need to act now, not tomorrow." As the debate raged on, the chamber was filled with a tense atmosphere. Jenrick's words continued to reverberate around the House. "The problem is clear. We've been witness to a blatant lack of action. Thousands of girls have been abused, and the government continues to ignore the severity of the situation. It's time to stop with the politics and start thinking about the victims. Or is the government afraid of the truth?" From his seat, the Prime Minister watched the opposition with a look of disdain, but his words lacked the weight they once carried. The opposition had managed to meet him on his own turf, and the question of the lack of a national inquiry resonated louder than ever. How much longer would the country wait to demand justice? The reality was that, while politicians continued their back and forth, the victims kept waiting for answers. The housing crisis in the UK has been worsening for years, and now, with the new stamp duty changes, the outlook for homebuyers looks even bleaker. Starting from the 1st of April 2025, the British government will implement new stamp duty rules, which will add thousands of pounds to the cost of buying a property. This decision, although presented as a measure to increase tax revenue and alleviate pressure on public services, is receiving fierce criticism from the opposition, who see it as an unnecessary burden on those already struggling to secure affordable housing. A couple of weeks before the deadline, in a small estate agent's office in central London, John and Sarah, two young professionals, sit down with their property advisor, Richard. The conversation is tense, as both have been struggling to find a property that fits their needs and budget. John, nervously, looks at the papers on the desk, while Sarah sits beside him with a frustrated expression on her face. "Are you sure this is the best time to buy? With the stamp duty changes coming, don't you think everything's going to go out of control?" says John, his tone full of concern. Sarah, nodding at Richard, adds, "Yeah, this all sounds like madness. Before we know it, prices will rise even further. It's not like we didn't have enough pressure already with current housing prices." Richard, the estate agent, responds in his usual calm but serious manner. "Well, the situation's not simple. From April, the thresholds for first-time buyers will be lowered. That means many of you will have to pay stamp duty much earlier than you expected. In fact, it could end up being more than you originally planned to spend. It's a disaster," mutters Sarah. "It's a trap for those just starting out. But the pressure to buy now is immense. With all the madness before the deadline, I'm afraid we'll be left behind." "Exactly," says John, rubbing his head in discomfort. "All these buyers trying to purchase before the costs go up. What if things just grind to a halt after the deadline? What if the market just collapses?" Richard looks at both of them thoughtfully. The market is already in a very critical state. Interest rates are rising, making it harder for people to get affordable mortgages. And if you add these changes to the stamp duty, all we can predict is more uncertainty. It might be that buyers decide to wait and see what happens, which could slow things down even more. Sarah crosses her arms, a mixture of disbelief and anger on her face. "And what's the government going to do? Keep pushing these policies that only make things worse for most of us?" "It's hard to say," Richard replies, "but we know demand is still there. And while prices are adjusting, the truth is that properties are still out of reach for a large portion of the population. The government doesn't seem to understand the burden this places on first-time buyers. They just don't realize how hard it is for an average family to find something affordable. It's a complete mess," adds John, his voice laced with frustration. "The government's pushing people to make decisions they don't want to make. There are families who can't even dream of buying a house because of all this. But of course, the government will keep on with its narrative, saying this will adjust things and that prices will stabilize." Stabilize for who? The conversation in Richard's office reflects the growing concerns about housing accessibility in the UK. In recent weeks, the market has been under immense pressure as buyers rush to complete their transactions before the new stamp duty thresholds are applied. This frenzy is forcing many to make rushed decisions, fearful of getting stuck in a market where housing prices are already out of reach. Despite the sense of despair in the room, Richard maintains his professional stance. The changes to stamp duty are just part of the story. The housing crisis existed before this new policy. But now, with rising interest rates, more people will be forced out of the market or will have to delay their purchase plans. John laughs bitterly. It's as if young people are being clipped at the wings. It's like they are telling us, want a house? Well, we'll see about that. But you'll have to pay much more for it, while those who already own a house keep benefiting from this situation. Sarah looks at John, her eyes filled with resignation. Exactly. The market's playing against us. Prices have never been higher, and now, with the stamp duty changes, opportunities for first-time buyers are simply vanishing. And it's not just the money, it's the stability. The government's policies are cornering people. The three sit in silence for a moment, reflecting on the future of the housing market in the UK. It's clear that the outlook is uncertain, and the housing crisis remains unresolved. Meanwhile, homebuyers like John and Sarah face the dilemma of whether to buy now, at a higher price, or to wait, hoping that conditions will improve, even though the stamp duty changes don't seem likely to favor most people. Finally, after a long pause, Richard breaks the silence with a serious look. What's clear is that things are going to remain tense. And if urgent measures aren't taken to address the housing crisis, we could see the market simply grind to a halt because buyers just won't be able to afford it. That's something no one wants to see, but it could be what happens. John nods slowly. So, what we're seeing here isn't just a crisis, it's a ticking time bomb. Sarah sighs, looking out the window. And who knows how big the explosion will be when it finally goes off. With the uncertainty of the future hanging over them, they stand up, aware that, no matter what decision they make, the housing market remains a battlefield of uncertainty, where the most vulnerable are left behind while the more fortunate continue to forge ahead. In conclusion, it's clear that the political landscape is becoming increasingly divided, with both Labour and the Prime Minister coming under fire for their handling of the grooming gang issue. The lack of accountability and evasive tactics by politicians only fuel the public's frustration. As the debate rages on, one thing is certain: the demand for justice and transparency is louder than ever. The question is, will those in power listen and act accordingly, or will they continue to dodge the tough questions? It's up to all of us to keep pushing for answers and demand the respect we deserve. What are your thoughts? Drop them in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe for more sharp political analysis. The story is far from over, and we'll be here to follow it every step of the way.